Howdy, folks. I'm Hank Sheffer, and welcome to another true life story right here with Larry Hedrick on Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.
Let me tell you about Bob Ward. Bob Ward came out here in 1958 for a specific purpose of looking for the Lost Dutchman gold mine. And he partnered up with different people, and he worked alone, and he wrote a book. I don't remember the name of it, but it's not a book I would buy because, in my opinion, it was quite full of fictitious material. And since Bob's dead, I feel free to say that. But he spent a lot of time. I think he spent about 20 years looking for the Lost Dutchman Mine. And I've sat down with him several times. He used to come up to the museum. He tried to get the museum to sponsor a Lost Dutchman trail through the mountains. And in fact, two of our board members went on a trek with him and spent about 5 days going through the Superstition with him, and Bob was showing them this mark here and that mark there and how that played into the stone maps and all that, all caught up in the Dutchman legend. And of course, the board didn't buy it, and we didn't sponsor any of his activities. Yeah, he became a central figure with a lot of Dutch hunters. Everybody knew him. I didn't consider him to be a dangerous person. I've met more dangerous people. We've all had stories about Crazy Jake and stuff like that. Crazy Jake wouldn't scare me a bit compared to Chuck Crawford and Bob Ward, who ended up shooting each other out there in the mountains. They didn't hit each other, but somebody shot one of their mules and all that kind of stuff. And this was back in the days when Ed Piper and Celeste Jones were having their feud right out there at Weaver's Needle, and people were shot and killed. You know, it was those kind of days. This is one of the reasons that when we go in the mountains, we carry a gun. I don't carry a gun ever, other than the fact of going in the mountains. It's just because you don't know who you're going to run into. A number of years ago, further back than I like to remember, I got a call from my friend Tom Collenborn a little after 10 o'clock in the evening, and he says, "You want to go on an adventure, Larry?" And I said, "Well, sure, it's something to do." And I said, "I'll come over to your house in about 15 minutes. And he said, "Well, be sure and bring your gun. I'll explain later." So I got over there, and we spent about, I would say, 30 minutes driving east on Highway 60 through Gold Canyon. And we turned off the road and crossed a cattle guard and followed a fence on the east side of the fence over open desert. I wasn't even sure where we were. But finally, we came to an area where there was a dozen cars scattered in parking, you know, and there was a cabin there, and there was 12 to 15 guys seated around this huge fire pit. I mean, it was big. And just off to the right, there was a saguaro cactus that had a 2x4 wired to it, made into a cross, and 4x5 cards. I went over and looked at it. There was the name of all the Dutch hunters, starting with Jacob Waltz, going right down through all the known ones that were dead and some that were alive. And these guys were all there toasting in tin cups to each one of those names. And we got there about midnight, and they were soused. There was no two ways about it. Tom had explained that some of these guys don't like each other. And Bob, who put this thing together, he insisted that everybody wear a gun in plain sight. He felt if everybody knew that everybody had a gun, there'd be less chance of a problem. So while we were standing there watching these guys, because Tom and I are teetotalers, we don't drink a drop, all of a sudden sparks flew up out of that fire pit all over the place, and these guys didn't even realize that it had happened. And I heard the report of a gunshot. Somebody had shot right down in the middle of that fire pit. But I got to back up a little bit to explain why that happened. While we first got there, another car pulled in behind us, and Bob went down to the car, and we could hear that voices were raised, but we couldn't hear what was being said, and the car left in what I would call a huff. And about 45 minutes later, a car came back and was parked up on the ridge. I could see the glow of its headlights, although I couldn't actually see the headlights themselves. And that's where the shot came from. Well, I went over and told Bob that, hey, somebody's shooting down here in the fire pit. And he could have cared less. And I no sooner said it than another round come in, and sparks went everywhere, and Bob just jumped up and he says, "Get your rifles, men. We're going to assault that hill." And pretty quick, here come the car down in the parking area. And Bob went down there, and it turned out it was his wife. They didn't bring their guns, and he run them off. And she was so angry about it, she went back and got their guns and come back and started shooting in the fire pit. Well, while Bob was talking to him, she tried to run him over. And Bob had his hand on the headlight of the car. The car was pushing him around in this circle. She was literally trying to run over the guy. And while the shooting was going on, Tom and I hid behind the bear kegs. We didn't think anybody'd shoot the bear kegs. But finally, Tom decided that it's time to go. So we went home. Well, a couple of days later, Tom calls me and he says, there was a gunfight out there that night. Somebody challenged Bob, and evidently Bob won. And that guy hasn't been heard from. And I think I know where Bob would have buried him if that took place. And he wanted to go back out there, but he didn't want us to just go alone. So my cavalry guys, I had about 75 years of prior service in my cavalry group, and 4 of them were new recruits that I had recruited that were fresh out of the Marine Corps, and they had been in Vietnam. And I mentioned to their leader about this, if they wanted to go on an adventure, and they were all for it. And they were having a lark. I mean, they were making so much noise out there, it was impossible to sneak up on that cabin. They didn't think anybody was going to be shooting back, and they were all armed to the teeth, you know. But they didn't know Bob Ward. Bob Ward's the guy that will shoot first and ask questions later. I'm not kidding you. And Tom got so concerned we called the hunt off. But even a few weeks later, he explained to me that guy has never been heard from since, and he was convinced that he got killed out there. The cabin was full of bullet holes, inside and out. You know, Bob was probably doing target practice on cockroaches. I don't know, but that's the end of that story.
Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.